Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and a double bill today, or another one tomorrow, depending on where you are in the world. So right now we're off to our Monte Cassino again, and today the spotlight falls on New Zealand's role in the battle. Glyn Harper returns to the channel to share his insight. His book on Monte Cassino, which covers the campaign and the controversies, is of course in the description below. And if you join us again later today, or again tomorrow, depending on where you are, we're looking at the 8th Air Force, some of the men who evaded capture. That'll be with Bill Yen tonight. So I'm looking forward to that one. But I'll bring Glyn in now. Good evening where you are, Sir Glyn. How are you today?
Yeah, very well, thanks, Paul. It's a pleasure to be back.
So Monte Cassino, we were just chatting, it is often talked about it. Of the Italian campaign, it's probably the battle that everybody knows the best, I suppose. Is New Zealand's role understood by people around the world? Obviously in New Zealand they understand that the units were there, but do you think around the world people have really grasped how international that campaign is?
No, and hopefully that will come out in my presentation today. One of the things that I'll wind up on when I look at the assessment is just how international it was. In terms of New Zealand's understanding of its contribution to the Second World War, the Italian campaign, I have to say, is largely forgotten. There has been a book come out recently called something like Continuous and Ongoing Sacrifice, History of the Second World War, based on a series of conference papers, and the Italian campaign is barely mentioned, and I don't think Monte Cassino is mentioned at all. So wow. It is fading from the public imagination, I have to say.
Well, that's a shame, but if we're watching today, then at least a few people are learning about it. So we'll bring up your PowerPoint, and folks, lots of slides, lots of information. Fire away with questions. We'll deal with the majority of them towards the end of the show today, but if there's anything pertinent to what's on screen, we'll kind of deal with them as we go along. But I hand over to Glyn to take us through this campaign.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paul. I will just point out that I'm actually talking about all of the battles of Monte Cassino tonight, not just the two that the New Zealanders were involved in, because I think you can really only understand it as a whole. And in some ways, the breakup is somewhat artificial because there's fighting ongoing all the time. This is what I'm going to cover tonight. I'm going to very briefly look at why Italy and why Cassino. I'm going to look at each battle in turn, starting with the first one, obviously the January battle. I'm going to look at what they planned to do, how it was executed and its outcome. And I'm going to do that for all four battles. And of course, I'm going to cover probably one of the most controversial aspects of the whole Italian campaign, and that is the bombing of the Abbey or the monastery on Monte Cassino, the Benedictine Abbey, which has stood there for thousands of years. I have to say, been destroyed 3 times before as well, and rebuilt after each time. But of course, it was destroyed again in 1944 as a deliberate act of war. And I'll be looking at that decision and pointing out that it was probably the right decision, but it was also a tactical mistake, which hopefully will come through my presentation tonight. So I'm going to start with, what are they doing in Italy anyway? Well, Italy had always been the weakest member of the Axis, and it was hoped that it might be able to knock Italy out after the fall of North Africa. That offered some easy pickings. And of course, the Soviet Union throughout 1942 and even before that had been pressuring the Allies to open up a second front, and Italy offered the prospect of that. And the resources were already there after the Operation Torch landings in North Africa. That is, there was the British 8th Army, a very experienced fighting force, suddenly victorious in 1942. There was the US Army building up steadily. There was the landing craft that were available, and also all the shipping. And of course, also Italy offered airfields which were particularly close to the countries of Eastern Europe, particularly Romania and the Ploesti oil field, which was an attractive target. So the decision was made to invade Sicily and see what happens, and then they would decide what would happen once Sicily was taken. And Sicily was taken relatively quickly, although they did let most of the Germans escape. Then there was this pause. What do we do next? I mean, we've cleared North Africa. We've got the island of Sicily. We can't just sit around. We need to follow up. And the pressure to invade Italy was overwhelming. And so in September 1943, that's exactly what happened. I have to say, though, that there was a major difference in the Allies. The American commanders were never keen on doing Italy, but they allowed themselves to be persuaded. And of course, Winston Churchill, very persuasive in argument, and was able to convince their commanders, and particularly their president, that they should invade Italy. And he once described it as the soft underbelly of the crocodile, the back door, if you like, into Europe and the back door into Nazi Germany. But as Mark Clark, the American commander of the Fifth Army, once said, he said, I could see Churchill before those maps being really persuasive, talking about a soft underbelly, but what we got, in fact, was one tough old gut, which I have to say is quite an apt description. Keep in mind that the Italian campaign is actually a unique campaign in the Second World War. And Rob Satano, in his book, The Wehrmacht's Last Stand, actually makes this point, that the Italian campaign was unique, that it was primarily an economy of force operation. That is, it was always a secondary campaign where both sides basically didn't want to be there, but were there in order to tie down as much of the other side as possible. So it's unique in that aspect, that there's a secondary campaign, always seen as economy of force operations. Of course, when economy of force operations, you try and commit the minimum amount possible to make it happen. So what are we doing in Cassino, which really is one of the strongest parts of the line, the Gustav line? Well, at the end of 1943, having narrowly been avoided being driven into the sea at Salerno, the American Fifth Army advanced north of Naples to its first massive river crossing at the Volturno. They soon found themselves up against one natural obstacle after another. But at the end of the year, they had managed to push the Germans back to the Gustav line. And here you see a map of it stretching across Italy from one sea to the other. And this is a very formidable defensive line. It follows the course of three wide and deep rivers, the Rapido, the Garry, and the Garigliano. It also consists of a row of fortress-like strong points, many of them made of reinforced concrete, valleys along rivers and ridge lines, and all approaches to this Gustav line are heavily mined or booby-trapped, with German artillery positions well sighted and hidden away. A perfect defensive position. But if you look where Cassino is placed in the Liri Valley on one of the main roads into Rome, it is a natural defensive position. Sorry, I went backwards. You can see it from this illustration here, which is done in 1944 and appeared on the cover of Time in April of that year. You can see how those mountains dominate this Liri Valley and the road to Rome. There are several things that you should note on this. The railway station, which is where the New Zealand Maori Battalion wind up fighting. You have the Abbey up on the hill above the town, the Continental Hotel and Hangman's Hill. It's really a magnificent drawing. You can see that Monte Cassino with its monastery dominates this area. It's at 518 metres or 17,000 feet, and it has perfect observation over this whole Liri Valley. Now that's an illustration of it. Here's what it looks like in reality, and this is taken from a photograph in the New Zealand archives. You can see the river, you can see the railway station, you can see the monastery on the hill, you can see the town of Cassino at the bottom of that hill. Now, Cassino had been evacuated and all the houses had been made into shelters or bunkers, and some of the larger houses had tanks hidden within them. So this is a very strong defensive position, one that really should be avoided if at all possible. But what we have is we have 4 battles fought around this location, and it results in 6 months of attritional warfare, with the Allies attacking at the strongest part of the line. They do try an amphibious landing behind Cassino at Anzio, which I'll talk briefly about, but won't focus on. But we have 4 battles of Cassino, which will involve a massive amount of air power and eventually 2 Allied armies, the US Fifth Army and the British Eighth Army. But I'm going to now turn and look at each of these 4 battles in turn, starting with the first battle of Monte Cassino. On the 15th of January 1944, the Fifth Army managed to capture Mount Trocchio, and this photograph here is actually taken from the summit of Mount Trocchio, looking into the Luri Valley towards the town of Cassino. It captured Mount Trocchio after an immensely tough fight. The Fifth Army was exhausted and really weak. It had taken this army of some 8 divisions 6 weeks to advance 7 miles or 11 kilometers. And in that advance, that short advance of some 7 miles, the Fifth Army had suffered over 16,000 casualties, making it a short, bloody advance. Now, those tired, weak, cold and hungry soldiers and those units and formations were in desperate need of rest, and they also needed reinforcement, but they would get neither, because after capturing Mount Trocchio, they were ordered to make an attack on the Gustav line, which, as I mentioned before, is one of the strongest positions, German positions in Italy. Why? Because the Allies had planned this landing at Anzio, and they needed an attack at Cassino to draw in as many of the German defenders as possible, which would hopefully give Anzio a clear run. Now, amphibious landings are always difficult and risky and need a lot of coordination, and the Allies had considerable experience mounting them. But the Anzio amphibious operations was somewhat different. It was going to be a small amphibious operation. At one stage, Mark Clark was only going to land 1 division, his best division, the US 3rd Division, commanded by Lucien Truscott at Anzio. But in the end, he settled for 2 divisions plus some subsidiary forces like Rangers and Commandos. And they could only land 2 divisions because there are only 68 landing craft left in the theatre, and they were only allowed to hold on to those 68 landing craft until the end of January. So they basically had to do a landing in Italy before the end of January with 68 landing craft, and that meant Anzio with only 2 divisions. But they hoped that landing those 2 divisions, they could at least advance a considerable distance inland, take the Auburn Hills, which was some 17 miles inland from Anzio and just 15 miles from Rome, overlooking the 2 main highways, Highway 6 and 7. That was the plan for Anzio. As we know, it didn't go that smoothly. But the plan for Anzio entailed the Fifth Army to make a series of attacks on the Cassino front to keep the Germans pinned down there and occupied, to focus their attention away from this new landing. And they came up with a 4-phase plan to do that. And here is that 4-phase plan. Phase 1 would kick off on January the 17th with the British 10th Corps crossing the Garigliano River. Phase 2, the US 2nd Corps would force its way across the Rapido River 5 miles south of Cassino and advance in the Luri Valley. Phase 3, the French Expeditionary Corps would advance in the hills to the north and hopefully threaten the right flank of the Luri Valley. And of course, Phase 4 would be 6th Corps with 2 divisions strong at this time landing on the beach at Anzio. And the key to success was really how well the Anzio landing went. Now, surprisingly, phases 1 and 3 went really well, but phase 2, if I just go back to it, this is the US 2nd Corps crossing the Rapido south of Cassino, was an absolute disaster. The Fifth Army used only 1 division, the US 36th Division. They had to carry boats and equipment through flooded fields and minefields just to reach the Rapido River, which was deep and fast flowing, happened to be in flood. And on the other side, the German defenders were well prepared and they could see the attack coming. But for 2 days, those men of the US 36th Division braved machine gun fire, mortar fire, rifle fire. Some did cross the river, but they were beaten back. Many were killed in the attempt to do so, and quite a few were captured. And one US reporter watching it said, and there's his quote there, that this is the biggest disaster to American arms since Pearl Harbor. The members, I have to say, soldiers of the US 36th Division who survived this battle remained angry about it for the rest of their lives and basically blamed Mark Clark for this disaster.
And just to jump in, Glyn, we've got an entire show on that with Jeff Hunt next Thursday the 23rd.
Cool.
We're doing focusing on that. So yeah, brilliant stuff.
So that's all I'll say about it then, Paul.
Yep, so no, it's fine. It's just all for context. We love it.
All back, yep, all good background. Yep. Okay, but the Anzio landing actually went reasonably well. It achieved some complete surprise and very few casualties. But instead of advancing towards the Auburn Hills, the division stayed on the Anzio beachhead, built up their strength, and according to Winston Churchill, he thought a great opportunity had been lost. And this is his famous quote about Anzio, the quote about they were going to throw a wildcat, and all we got was a stranded whale. Here you can see why he's a bit disappointed. The Auburn Hills are way up to the northwest. They didn't even get close. They carved out a little beachhead and basically built it up and stayed there. I have to say the local commander I don't think should be blamed for this, because the very last thing that Mark Clark said to him before landing, he says, "Don't stick your neck out. I did it at Salerno and look what nearly happened." So he had good reason to be cautious, and he was very cautious, and it was a very disappointing outcome. But we've thrown in one US division, the 36th, around the town of San Angelo, and it's got hammered. On the 24th of January, they try again with another US division, the 34th Division. Another frontal assault, once again across the Rapido, wading that icy river, making the attack under observation. And the 34th Division fought for 8 days to cross the Rapido, and they actually got to within 400 yards of the monastery, but they could get no further. They made one last attempt in early February, but the division was weak and exhausted, and nobody expected to succeed, and it didn't. Now, the New Zealand division, who's moved into this area, Major General Howard Kippenberger, actually goes forward and watched this last attack, and this is what he said of these American soldiers: that they'll battle since January with the stubbornness and gallantry beyond all praise, but they were worn out, and some of their units had suffered some 80% casualties. A little wonder that they were in that state. Now, the commanders, particularly of the Mark Clark of the US Fifth Army, looked around for somebody else to take the battle to the Germans at Cassino. And at the end of January, 2 divisions were transferred from the British 8th Army to the US 5th Army, and there are their divisional emblems there. The 2nd New Zealand Division and the 4th Indian Division formed into the 2nd New Zealand Corps under Lieutenant General Sir Bernard Freyberg, and there's a portrait of Freyberg there. And Clark's Chief of Staff, a picture of him on the right, General by the name of Algrunta, said to him, "We are now going to throw the torch to you. This is where we throw the torch to you. You take over at Cassino. You see what you can do." And this is where the New Zealanders and the Indians do the next 2 attacks and take part in the next 2 battles. But before they do, the monastery on Monte Cassino is subjected to an air attack. Now, the first request for this had come from the commander of the 4th Indian Division, Major General Francis Chuka, who's there on the left next to Freyberg. And Chuka felt that if his Indians were going to actually assault this position, the position needed to be bombed, because he felt that it was a perfect artillery observation position and that the Germans would be using it. Freyberg agreed with him and passed that request up the chain of command. Mark Clark didn't agree and emphatically overruled it, but it went higher than Mark Clark, and General Alexander approved the bombing of this famous historic site. In fact, one American Air Force senior commander was looking forward to it, and they said to Freyberg, "You let me use my whole bombing force and I'll whip it out like a dead tooth." Rather graphic expression. They warned the people in the monastery that it was going to be bombed because there were priests, there were refugees, Italian refugees mainly from the town of Cassino, sheltering there. They dropped leaflets on them, but those people did not go. Now Freiburg had requested some 36 medium bombers to soften up the target. What he got was much more than this. First off, he got 135 B-17 flying fortresses, and in the space of half an hour, they unloaded 257 tons of high explosives and 59 tons of incendiary, which are burning bombs on the monastery. Got to say, a lot of those actually missed. In fact, the estimation is that over half of those missed. But then 87 medium bombers appeared and they dropped a further 283 1,000-pound bombs. Now, most of those missed too, but enough struck the monastery to damage it. And, of course, this added to this is the Allied artillery, which opened up on the monastery, and the monastery was destroyed. I've got to say, sad to say, most soldiers who watched it cheered and clapped as the bombs fell, although Mark Clark recorded that he felt sick at heart. Now, here's the rub with this. The unfortunate fact was that this bombing gave no advantage to the Allies. The 4th Indian Division was actually not informed that it was going to happen, and it was not ready to make an attack on that day or the next day. In fact, it didn't make an attack till the 18th of February, 3 days later. And meanwhile, the Germans, if they weren't there before the monastery was bombed, they were certainly there after it, as they moved into the rubble and the tunnels and they burrowed beneath it, and they all made excellent defensive positions. It actually improved the German defensive positions at Monte Cassino, not eroded it in any way. And Mark Clark is quite right when he says that this was a tactical mistake of the first magnitude. It only made the job more difficult and more costly in terms of men, machines, and time. It's not the actual bombing that was the mistake, it was the timing of it, and the fact that the Indians didn't know that it was coming. Which leads us on to the Second Battle of Monte Cassino between the 15th and 18th of August. Both divisions, the 4th Indian and the 2nd New Zealand Division, were ready on the 15th of February. The 4th Indian were going to use 3 infantry battalions, which would sweep across the slopes and ravines to launch a direct attack on the monastery. As this was happening, the 28th Maori Battalion would advance from Mount Chokio along the railway embankment and capture the railway station. And you can see this in this map here. Off to the left are the Indian battalions, 3 of them making a direct attack on the monastery, and the Maori Battalion advancing along the embankment down to the south towards the railway station. Now, the success of this whole operation depended on the New Zealand engineers who were to follow the Maori soldiers. Those sappers had to repair all the demolitions along the embankment so that Bailey bridges could be built across 2 water obstacles, repair all the craters that had been made so that tanks, anti-tank guns, and vital supplies could reach those forward at the railway station. Now, the Indians had a very hard job fighting uphill towards the monastery, and from the moment they set off just after dark, they were under constant machine gun and mortar fire. They ran into many German booby traps, but they pushed steadily on, and eventually the lead battalion reached to within just 300 yards from the monastery, but there was a line of machine guns which fired across the full width, creating a deadly killing ground, and they couldn't get any closer than that. Meanwhile, on the flat below them, some 600 metres below them, the Maori soldiers advanced along the railway embankment. They too came up against mortar and machine gun fire. They also had to cross minefields and belts of barbed wire, but they did it, and by nightfall they had actually captured the railway station along with many German prisoners. Now, success depended on how well the engineers could bridge all those demolitions and build those 2 Bailey bridges. And the engineers worked frantically, but they just had so many jobs to do. They had to clear the minefields, the booby traps, the barbed wire. They had to fill in all the craters caused by the German demolition experts, and they had to build not one but two Bailey bridges, one over a canal and one over a river. I mean, Bailey bridges are fantastic, but they do take some time to build, and all of that was done under enemy and machine gun fire. Unfortunately, they didn't do it. As the daylight came, they had just one large demolition crater to fill as dawn broke, but because they were so exposed, they couldn't do it in daylight. Now, the Maori soldiers were told to hang on to the railway station, even though they had no tank support, no anti-tank guns, no protection from artillery. They were told to stay there and wait until nightfall until that one demolition could be repaired. Meanwhile, the New Zealand artillery would try to protect them, and they would do that by firing a dense smoke screen. The Maori soldiers were in a tough position that day. They'd already suffered 100 casualties in their night attack. If they could hold on, they might be able to do it. But just after 3 p.m., German tanks and infantry, using the smoke screen that the New Zealanders had created, attacked the railway station from both sides. There was a short, deadly exchange of fire. Some Maori soldiers were killed, a few were captured, but most withdrew back to the New Zealand positions. The Second Battle of Cassino was over and the Allies had lost again. There were several mistakes made which contributed to this defeat. First off, it was a mistake to bomb the monastery when the Indian division was not ready to attack. It was a mistake to rely solely on a smoke screen to protect the Maori soldiers at the railway station. It was probably a mistake to use just one battalion as well. And you have to wonder where the air cover was when the Allies ruled the sky. If that one demolition could have been repaired, this battle may have had a different outcome. There's no getting around the fact that luck does play an important part in war, but it was definitely not on the side of the Allies in this battle. And in fact, it wasn't for any of the battles at Monte Cassino.
And a quick question for you, Glenn. We had a comment from Ian here saying, if Cassino is the strongest point of the Gustav line, why keep attacking in there? Surely best to break the weakest part of the line. I mean, I know you explained the dominance and you showed us the geography there, but was there any way of kind of bypassing or hitting somewhere else?
Can I leave that till I get to the fourth battle? Because
you can.
That's exactly what they do. Absolutely. It doesn't make much sense to butt your head against the strong. In fact, I should point out that because I'm going to move on to the third battle now. The third battle, I'm sorry to say, is more of the same, which I'll cover it. And Kippenberger, the guy that I wrote about, was so disgusted with the fact that they hadn't come up with a new plan. He actually he threatened Freiburg that he would resign because it's just more of the same with the same outcome. He didn't resign, and Freiburg persuaded him to stay, but unfortunately he was badly wounded before this third battle. And Freiburg thinks he's got a new ace up his sleeve, which I'll cover now, which is going to counter the German, the strength of the German position, and that ace is air power, which I'm going to talk about. So both the 4th Indian and the 2nd New Zealand Division play a key role in this third battle, which is fought in March. This time, the plan involved the complete destruction of Cassino town by aerial bombing, and that use of overwhelming firepower from the air was supposed to make the job of the soldiers on the ground that much easier. Sorry, this is for the 1st New Zealand battle. Now, the Cassino couldn't be outflanked because of the rivers, particularly the Rapido. So it meant a direct attack on the town of Monastery Hill, with the 4th Indian Division and the 2nd New Zealand Division attacking side by side, advancing down 3 separate roads. The New Zealanders were allocated the town as their objective, and the Indians once again Monastery Hill. And if there was any success, there was a 3rd Division from 8th Army, the 78th, was held in reserve. Now, while this attack was similar to the first two battles, and as I say, I pointed out, Kippenberger was very upset with it, Freiburg and the Allies thought he had an ace card, and that was the use of overwhelming air power. The infantry attack would be preceded by a bombing as had never been done before in Italy. Cassino, now this fortified town containing only enemy soldiers, would be turned to dust. Those Germans sheltering in the town would all be killed by the bombing. And prior to the Indian and New Zealand soldiers advancing, Cassino and the monastery would be bombed for 4 hours. Then over 900 guns from the army and corps and the divisions involved would add to that destruction. And it was believed that nothing would be able to survive that onslaught. So preparations and plans were made and they were ready to go at the end of February, but bad weather delayed this attack until the middle of March, the 15th of March. And on that day, on a fine, clear morning, the 15th of March, 1944, 514 planes dropped their bombs on Cassino Town and Monastery Hill, the largest air operation to date in Italy. A total of 1,100 tons of high explosives fell on Cassino, 100 tons of high explosive for every square mile of town. It was absolutely devastating. When the bombs stopped falling, the Allied artillery opened up just after noon, and they fired over 200 rounds of artillery ammunition, adding another 1,200 tons of high explosive destructive high explosive to the town. I need to point out, though, that not all the bombs fell where they were supposed to, not on the town or Monastery Hill. And I've got to say, it's estimated that nearly half of the bombs missed their targets. In fact, Allied bombers dropped their loads on other Italian towns, mistaking them for Cassino. And this poor town of Venafro was particularly unfortunate because it was bombed more than 3 times on that day, despite being more than 10 miles away from Cassino. Now, those soldiers on the front line watching were also in danger, and bombs fell on the Allied side as well. Now, General Oliver Leese, the 8th Army commander, actually went up to the front line to watch the bombing and returned to his headquarters to find they'd been completely destroyed by Allied bombing. He said to his chief of staff, "I see our American friends have called." And then he rang up the 5th Army Commander, Mark Clark, and asked if he'd done anything to upset the Americans recently. So he could laugh about it, but unfortunately, some 96 Allied soldiers and 140 Italian civilians were casualties in that bombing. But despite that inaccuracy, enough bombs had fallen on the town. And combined with the artillery that began at noon, Cassino Town was all but destroyed. All that remained were heaps of rubble and old buildings. And General Alexander, who was watching along with everybody else, made the statement, "Nothing could be left alive in that town." But the Germans had suffered losses. More than half of those in Cassino had been killed or wounded. As one German soldier said, it was like the end of the world. Comrades were wounded, buried alive, dug out again, eventually buried for a second time. Whole platoons and squads were obliterated by direct hits. We wanted to escape from this living hell. But the one thing they didn't do was run away. The survivors linked arms to give each other support, held their hands tightly over their ears to protect their eardrums from damage. And when the bombings and the artillery stopped, the Germans emerged and were ready to fight. Now, believing that everyone in the town was dead or incapacitated, the New Zealanders only sent a small number of infantry soldiers to capture the town. The tanks that were meant to go with them were stopped by the large craters and piles of rubbish, and the New Zealanders and those watching the attack were absolutely stunned when the Germans emerged from their defensive positions and started fighting. The New Zealand attack on the town was easily beaten off. Now, that evening, the Indian Division again tried to capture Monastery Hill through very difficult terrain. They captured a second objective called Hangman Hill, but they could not get anywhere near the monastery. And over the next 2 weeks, despite more bombing and artillery barrages and repeated infantry attacks, the Germans held the western edge of Cassino Town and Monastery Hill. Nothing could shift them. It was a grim, tough battle, and for both sides, the casualties steadily mounted. So New Zealanders have taken a lot of the town, but not the western edge of it against the hill. And When General Freiberg visited, he saw that things were not going well. In fact, on the 22nd of March, the New Zealand division made one last attempt, and when it failed, General Alexander stepped in and said, like, close this battle down, and close the battle down for the monastery as well. And on the 24th of March, the Indians abandoned their hold on Hangman's Hill. And Freiberg, who saw the New Zealanders on the 22nd of March, he wrote, "The New Zealand division has come to the end of its tether. The New Zealand soldiers in Cassino Town," and I'm quoting from something he wrote in his diary, "were in the worst military position that I've ever seen troops in." It was an accurate assessment. This third battle cost the Allies more than 2,000 casualties. Losses in the Indian division were over 1,000, with nearly 150 being killed, another 155 missing. New Zealand casualties for the 7 weeks the Corps was around Cassino were over 1,392, with 206 being killed and another 106 missing. This is a tragedy for the New Zealand Corps. And I leave you with this quote from M. McGibbon, one of our foremost military historians. Cassino, he says, was a costly failure, which ranks alongside Passchendaele as among our worst ever military disasters. That's a German propaganda cartoon produced around the time, by the way, and a very effective one it is.
And Peter Cohen is asking, do we know what the ratio was of attackers to defenders in, for example, the third battle?
We do, but I don't have it to hand. The Germans were outnumbered. The problem was the New Zealand division commander, and I'll point this out later on, they dribble in infantry. They have the numbers, but they don't commit them in any large amount. They really needed more infantry power, which I'll say a little bit later on. Now, both the Allied and German soldiers agreed that it was the quality of the German soldiers defending the town and the monastery that won this battle. The German commander at Cassino stated to a superior officer, to Kesselring, he said, and I'm quoting from him, "No troops but the first parachute division could have held Cassino." And General Alexander remarked to Kippenberger some weeks later, "If you had not been faced by the best division in the German army, you would have succeeded." So the third battle of Cassino was yet again another clear victory for the German defenders. This battle was lost for three main reasons. First is the sheer quality of the German defenders. Second is that the plan was poor, and I'll go back to the comment your watcher made before, that frontal assaults on well-defended positions really succeeded. And that had been demonstrated in the two previous battles, and this third battle was more of the same. And third, getting back to the question that was asked just before, the ground attack, when it came, lacked force, speed, and aggression. The New Zealand Corps commander, I'm talking about Freiberg, had relied too much on air and firepower to win the battle. What he needed was more infantry power, but he didn't commit it, certainly on the day of the attack, nor as the attack proceeded. I'm going to move on to the fourth and final battle because things actually change. Now, General Alexander was sick of losing at Cassino, and he took direct charge and regrouped his forces. And rather than attacking in just one place at the strongest part of the German defense, the Allies would use all their assets together. They would plan a battle that was bigger, but was also better than before, attacking on a wide front with everything they had. And there's Alexander's quote. Alexander had a quote that he remembered from Lord Horatio Nelson: "Only numbers can annihilate." And he was determined to use his overwhelming force to crush the Germans at Cassino. But Alexander wasn't a great planner. So to assist him, this gentleman here was sent out by the Chief of Imperial General Staff, Alan Brooke. It was suggested by Montgomery. He needed a new planner, and I have to say John Harding, later on Field Marshal John Harding, John is his nickname, I think it's Alan Francis from memory, he is one of the, I think, the unsung heroes of the Second World War. Not only a good combat commander, but also a great staff officer and a great planner. So he's sent out to assist Alexander, and he comes up with a plan that followed the fundamental principle of war that he thought the Allies had ignored up till this point, and that was concentration of force. He devised a plan that would not only intended to capture vital ground and cities, but one that would entrap and destroy the German ground forces in Italy. A grand offensive which he codenamed Operation Diadem. Now, diadem is a type of crown, I understand. And in this fourth battle of Monte Cassino, there were some critical differences to the ones that came before. First off, it was not going to be rushed. It was not going to be made to assist the landing at Anzio, or it was not going to be attacked when ready. When they weren't ready, they would take their time. And secondly, they would use overwhelming force. Something you will have noticed up till now is that at Monte Cassino, the Allies in the Fifth Army are using one division. In the case of New Zealanders in the second battle, one battalion. They're using dribs and drabs of forces, not their overwhelming force, which they have at their fingertips. The attack would also be made in fine spring weather so that air power could be used. Wheeled vehicles and large formations could also be used. The ability to maneuver. And for the first time, an elaborate deception plan would be used to convince the Germans that they were going to make another amphibious landing somewhere north of Rome. And to do that, they erected fake signs, fake false radio messages, military exercises, phantom formations, to convince the Germans that a new amphibious landing was being planned. And it did work. The Germans were anticipating another amphibious landing of 3 divisions somewhere north of Rome, and they kept back many of their reserves to counter that landing. Now, while the deception plan was happening, Alexander moved most of 8th Army and into the Liri Valley alongside the 5th Army, ready for Operation Diadem. And he did have overwhelming force. That was a simple plan. Okay, on the right, and if you look at the right of the line here, you have the 8th Army, which will break into the Liri Valley, finally capture Cassino and the monastery, and advance towards Rome. Its initial attacking force would be the Polish Corps, who would take the Cassino feature, while the British 13th Corps was to advance along the road to Rome. On their left, the 5th Army would advance towards Rome along the main coastal road and along the mountains that form the left wall of the Liri Valley. The US 2nd Corps would be allocated the coastal road, and the French Corps would be allocated the mountain fighting, of which they had plenty of experience. A massive concentration of force was built up, including 2,000 tanks, 1,600 guns, 3,000 aircraft, all deployed along a 20-mile or 32-kilometre front. That's 45 guns, 57 tanks, 85 aircraft for every 1,000 yards. And infantry soldiers from 8.5 divisions would be used on the opening day of the attack, with more to follow as the reserves were committed. Now, alongside this, and I won't say too much about this, Paul, because I understand you've already had a little bit about this, but it also coincides with an air operation called Operation Strangle, which aimed to harass the Germans as much as possible from the air, targeting railways, roads, bridges, ports, in effect to starve the German forces of all their supplies. And that started before Operation Diadem, so it starts on the 19th of March and continues until the fall of Rome. And it was a massive effort. Some 120,000 sorties were being flown, while the Germans did not give up the Gustav line as Allied commanders hoped. They were certainly seriously affected by it, receiving only half the daily supplies that they needed. Now, at 11 p.m. On the 11th of May, the 1,600 guns opened fire in unison, a terrifying sound. For 45 minutes, they opened up with a barrage on every known German position, and then the word came to advance. And across a 20-mile front, the infantry from 2 armies and many different nationalities advanced towards an uncertain fate. But all along the line, despite the overwhelming firepower, the preparations made, the deception plans, the Allied forces still struggled to make any progress. And this was especially true for the Polish Corps around the ruins of the Monte Cassino Abbey. Now, the Poles on the right flank and the Americans on the extreme left, they struggled to take their objectives, but the French Corps in the center had the most success. I mean, they were attacking through the mountains. It was where it wasn't expected. And they not only took all their objectives, but the French commander pushed forward all his reserves to exploit that success. And on the left side of Monte Cassino, the 8th Indian Division and the 4th British Division on the flat reached their objectives, crossed the Rapido, and expanded their bridgeheads. German counterattacks, despite their ferocity, were beaten back. Now, and Cassino was being slowly encircled. For the next 2 days, the battle continued. Both Allied and German casualties mounted. The 8th Indian and the 4th British made more crossings of the Rapido and expanded the bridgehead even more. But it was the progress of the French Corps that was spectacular. With 4 divisions in line, they captured crucial peaks. They pushed the Germans off their defensive positions, and the Germans were now worried that their right wing was in danger of collapse, and they started preparing to leave before it was too late. On the 14th of May, now reinforced by guns and tanks, the 8th Indian and the 4th British Division pressed forward to complete the encirclement of Cassino. It was so important that the 8th Army committed his 3 reserve divisions to assist, and the French continued their advance. The Poles carried out several attacks on the Abbey at Monte Cassino, the last one on the 17th of May, where they made a frontal assault, but they did not take the monastery. Their losses were heavy, and they prepared to mount an attack the following day. When they did so on the morning of the 18th of May, they found the monastery had been abandoned. Rather than risk encirclement and capture, the last of the German defenders withdrew during the night. Only those Germans too sick or wounded to walk were left behind. But it was the outflanking movements that had forced the Germans to leave the monastery and abandon the Gustav line. Many men had been killed or captured, trying to force the Germans off their position, and the Poles in their repeated attacks on the Abbey at Monte Cassino lost nearly 4,000 men, nearly half their force. But the battles of Monte Cassino were finally over. The road to Rome was open. I'll just make one comment about this. Part of Operation Diadem was the link up of the 5th Army advancing up the coast, and here you see 2nd Corps of the 5th Army linking up with the Anzio beachhead, which had now been built up to the size of an army, some 150,000 men. As they neared, they were supposed to break out and cut this Highway 7 at this town of Valmontone. They're making excellent progress towards it, where Mark Clark decided that he would like to be the first person into Rome with his American forces. So he ordered Lucien Truscott, who was now the commander in the Anzio beachhead, to pivot away from Valmontone and advance directly on Rome. A critical mistake which let the German 10th Army escape, and a failure for Operation Diadem. I'm now finished, and I just want to make 4 points by way of an assessment, and then I'll throw out for questions. First point to note is that these battles are a truly international affair. On the Allied side, there are soldiers and airmen from 26 separate nationalities fighting against the Germans in a massive coalition. Amongst those soldiers and airmen include men and women from Poland, France, India, Canada, New Zealand, Australia, South Africa, Brazil, the United States, and the United Kingdom, and I've probably missed many out. As John North, the historian of this campaign, has said, we're unlikely to see such an array again take the field under one command. The second point I would make, so the first point is what an international campaign this is. Second point, it witnesses some of the most savage fighting of the Second World War in the most dreadful of conditions, and even Adolf Hitler acknowledged this. And he once said that these were the only battles of the Second World War which were much like those on the First World War. So what are we talking about? Attritional struggles in mud and waste, frontal assaults with huge losses. So similar to the battles of the First World War. Third point I'd like to make is that, like the First World War, it's generally acknowledged that the standard of Allied military leadership during these battles was not that high. And John Ellis, who wrote a fantastic book on Cassino, you get this just from the subtitle, The Hollow Victory, is scathing about the quality of Allied leadership, and he makes some pertinent points. He says they were on the whole, both armies were poorly led, where operation was consistently marred by lack of strategic vision and slipshod staff work. And he points out that they're thrown in dribs and drabs and not given the resources to actually achieve their objectives. Attacks mounted in quite inadequate strength. Now, some senior Allied commanders actually acknowledged their failings at Cassino and in the early months of Italy. The senior Allied general in Italy was this gentleman here, General Jacob Devers, and he made the comment that we failed at Cassino and it was due to the kind of troops we had. The command had been changed, i.e. Montgomery and Eisenhower had gone, and the new people hadn't actually built them up to be a team, which did come later. And regarding the New Zealand Corps, I have to say this was not Freiburg's finest hour. Quite a few New Zealand historians have tried to gloss over Freiburg's performance at Cassino, but international historians have been scathing, and Major General Sir Howard Kippenberger knew the truth. And Kippenberger wrote, and I'm quoting from some of the letters and comments that he made on the official history, says that Freiburg was lost at Cassino and that it was his worst performance of the war. And Kippenberger thought that Freiburg knew that he was conscious of that himself. Now, Freiburg was certainly not his best at Cassino. He was weighed down with political considerations. He was still the commanding officer of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force, with all the political considerations that come with that. He was exhausted after 4 years of war without a rest, as both the GOC of the New Zealand Division, so a fighting commander, and the commander of the New Zealand Expeditionary Force's admin role, which had been split during the previous war. To make matters worse, having convinced Kippenberger, his most talented subordinate, to stay on, Kippenberger was then seriously wounded on the 2nd of March while making a reconnaissance on Mount Trocchio. Added to these burdens, and this is a natural worry, Freiburg was deeply worried about his only son, who was reported missing at Anzio. And a senior New Zealand officer, Brigadier William Stevens, recalled how Freiburg's spirits reached their lowest ebb at Cassino. And I give you this quote from Major General Bill Stevens. The only occasion, I think, when his normal optimism and confidence left him. But, okay, he's not at his best. We can understand why. But the tragic reality is that when commanders have bad days, men die. It's as simple as that. The casualties at Cassino were high. Over 100,000 Allied soldiers and at least 80,000 German soldiers became casualties in those 4 hellish battles at Monte Cassino. And we cannot forget the Poles. This is a very moving Polish memorial around Monte Cassino. And there is also the German cemetery near the village of Cairo, which I have a photograph of it here. This is one of the largest military cemeteries in Germany. There are more than 24,000 German soldiers buried here. They buried 3 soldiers to a grave, and many contain the words Ein deutscher Soldat, i.e. an unknown soldier, and it's repeated 3 times over. The battles and what those men went through on both sides should never be forgotten, and I'm glad that you're doing a program on the Italian campaign and the battles of Monte Cassino in particular. So thank you, Paul.
Well, thank you. As usual, superlative, fantastic stuff. So we've got a few questions. Some of them you were answering as you went along, but we'll start with the last one. Ernest Malley there. a lot has been made about veteran desert divisions having operational morale trouble in their later campaigns. Does Glyn have seen any such dynamics going on within the New Zealand division, in Italy?
Yes, there are. There's certainly that dynamic happening, and it's exacerbated somewhat in the fact that the New Zealand government institutes a furlough scheme immediately after the North African campaign and before the Italian campaign, where it sends home on furlough, on long leave, some 3,000 odd New Zealand soldiers, i.e. veterans from the North African campaign, and most of them refuse to come back. So there is this morale and operational trouble that's happening, particularly in Italy. And there's one famous case where a platoon at Orsona, so relatively early in the Italian campaign, actually refused to go into action, and that shocked all the senior commanders. Never happened before. Happened in Italy. And Freiberg could feel his division slipping in terms of military discipline, capability, and so on. And he insisted midway through the Italian campaign, particularly after Cassino, to pull them out, give them a period of rest, recreation, but also some solid training and getting their officers to grip them up again. And I have to say, something happens to Freiberg in Italy, which is to his benefit. He actually gets involved in an aircraft accident, so he has to go to hospital and recover, and he gets a period of rest which he hasn't had, up to that period. And when he comes back, he's as sharp as he ever was. The New Zealand division does suffer from morale and discipline problems, but when he comes back, it gets gripped up somewhat. And some of the last campaigns that the New Zealand division do, particularly crossing the Po River into the Po Valley and up to Trieste, are some of their best campaigns of the war, although they're not terribly well known about in New Zealand, because the focus tends to be on North Africa and Greece and Crete.
Well, that's a great answer there. And Freiberg, we've talked about it before on the channel. I think there's highs and there's definitely lows, and there's definitely some sort of average along the way. But you've got to look at the whole context of the length of time he's in the line, and the fact that some people have said in the sidebar he's not the youngest by the time you get to 44.
Absolutely not. No, and I do feel for him at Cassino, because he's actually worn out, and Kippenberger is the same. They're sent back to New Zealand after the end of the North African campaign, but they're not resting. They're going to all these political functions and being toured around the country to tell people how good they are. It's one function after another. I mean, at that age, he would be exhausted at that period, and we definitely don't see him at his best. Particularly when his son goes missing. I think we have to factor that in as well. His son actually escaped and was hiding in the Vatican, and so he survived and became Lord Freiberg eventually after his father died in 1965.
Brilliant stuff. And another question we're going to bring up Harding again. I'll go back to your sliding, because Ian Carr was asking, if he was so highly regarded by Brooke, why was he not already allocated to Overlord?
He was recovering from wounds in North Africa. So he had been seriously wounded during the Alamein fighting, sent back to recover, and was just on the road to recovery. So he was basically around. And I think Montgomery, for his faults, did want Alexander to do reasonably well. So he thought, well, here's the man. Montgomery knew his capabilities. Brooke consulted with Montgomery about his Brooke's final decision, and absolutely, he sends one of the best out there, primarily because he's recovering and he's not really available for combat command at this stage, but can certainly do the staff jobs, and did really well planning Operation Diadem.
Okay, thank you. And I want to ask a bit more about the 4th Indian Division, because being from Essex, there was an Essex battalion in the 4th Indian in one of the brigades. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for them over the years. And Tuka, I think, is an underrated commander. Al Murray rates Tuka highly in his command book. And yet Tuka doesn't really rise beyond divisional commander. Is there a reason why you think Tuka isn't climbing the ladder, or is he? What's your opinion on that?
I rate Chuka highly too, although I have to say at Monte Cassino he actually is quite ill, and he gets he brings a Brigadier Dimmerlin comes in to take over for him after the bombing of the monastery. So he's actually out of the Monte Cassino battle. Certainly, so he's out for the third battle because of the serious illness. Very astute commander too, Chuka. Read widely, studied the campaigns and terrain. I don't know why he didn't go further than he did, but there's always this stigma, isn't there, being Indian Army and British regular army.
Well, that's what I mean. I don't want to think it is that, but it probably is that, isn't it? It's.
I think it would have something to do with it. But certainly a fine divisional commander, no doubt about it.
Yeah, Nathan, and folks, we will have a show about the Indian Army in Monte Cassino. It'll be in June because Mandeep Singh Bawa, who's going to be my guest on that, is busy helping out with Indian elections that are going on right now and campaigning. But he'll be on the channel talk about their contribution, which was, as you said, enormous, the Indian contribution. But a question from Mehdi here, which I'm going to word slightly differently. And he's saying, I cannot imagine trying to assault that hill. Why is it that New Zealanders always seem to get the shit missions in First World War and Second World War? So is that a myth, or is there some reality to that? But it's one of those things I hear all the time, is that the Brits always give the Anzacs the shitty jobs in World War II or World War One. What's it's a big subject, but what's your initial reaction to that?
I think, to be honest, I don't think there's a lot of truth in it. I think there's just happens to be a lot of shitty jobs in war.
Exactly.
And when you have a shitty job, you want some of your best soldiers to take it on. And I would point out that the formation that gets some of the shittiest jobs in Italy, the Canadian Corps, fighting around Orsona or Tona, in some of the river crossings that they do. And of course, the Canadians a lot of them are taken back for Normandy as well, and as used at the spearhead. So I think you have to treat it with a grain of salt. They do get shitty jobs, absolutely, but there are an awful lot of shitty jobs, and when they can't do it, someone else has to come in and do it. Like the Poles, they seem to they seem to come in at some really horrible places too. I mean, they take over from the New Zealanders at Cassino, and the Indians at Cassino. The Poles take over from the Australians in Tobruk, of all places as well. Yeah. They tend to get some terrible places. There are a lot of shitty jobs in war, and I guess they do get spread around. But when they get spread around, you want your best people on those really difficult jobs.
No, I agree, and I think sometimes you can look for things too much. I mean, like the Polish Armored Division in Normandy, for example, have a crappy time in the Falaise Gap, but then you could argue they perhaps don't have the worst campaigns after Normandy as they push up. They end up liberating Ypres. So you can find examples of the foreigners being given the shit jobs. We can also find examples of the foreigners not being given the shit jobs. It depends what you're looking for. It's like many other things in World War II. If you're looking for struggling relationships between commanders, you can find them, but you can also find moments of them getting on very well, the commanders. It all depends on what how objective you're being when you're going into this, I think.
The thing too that I didn't mention is that the Poles, with their corps at Cassino, have made it a point of honor to take the Monte Cassino Abbey, and they were going to take that come hook or crook. And I think they probably carried out far too many frontal assaults on it. If they'd actually had not had that bloodlust and to prove the point that the Poles were back in the fight, they would have probably suffered fewer casualties, I think. But to them, it became a point of honor.
Yeah, and I think that the point Luke Truxell made last night is, despite the obvious setbacks of the Italian campaign and things not always working the first, second, or indeed third or fourth time, his lessons were learned. And the point he made about Strangle yesterday and Diadem is that they were planned in parallel, whereas rather than in tandem. They weren't really put together to work. They ended up working together, but they were planned separately. And how, as the Allies move forward in Normandy, there's much more attempt to try and have the air plan work with the ground plan from the conception level. So, I know it's an old chestnut is to say, well, yes, it didn't go very well, but there were lots of lessons learned. But the point is, the Allies are still learning lessons, and the Germans are maybe not always learning from some of their failings, whereas the Allies, I think, always are.
Yeah, and the thing is too, you're talking about this massive coalition, Paul, and coalition warfare isn't easy because people do things differently. I mean, we're different, you know. But I think Churchill hit the nail on the head when he said the only thing worse than fighting in a coalition is fighting without a coalition. So, you know, it's much worse if you don't have your allies alongside and you have to find a way to get on. And that's why I think Eisenhower was such a brilliant supreme commander, is that he, you know, was able to weld these diverse, disparate groups into a cohesive fighting team.
Yeah, that's a very good point. I mean, we did that. We talked about the Casablanca conference a few weeks ago on the channel, and if nothing else, the Germans saw the unity that came out of that. Some of it was staged unity when de Gaulle shook what's his father, the French other generals' hand there. But the Germans are struggling to maintain relationships within their own forces, Kriegsmarine, Luftwaffe, Wehrmacht, and their relationship with the Italians had kind of, I mean, okay, the Italians are out of it there, but the fact that the Allies have overcome most of their teething problems. I think 1943 was the year kind of, around the time of Torch, where things were strained between the Brits and Americans and Australia and New Zealand. But by 44, they're realizing we've just got to ride it through. And I think relationships are basically pretty healthy.
Yep, I agree. Yep.
Giro, that's the one. Yeah, thank you, Glyn, for remembering that. I can't remember every single name, but right, we'll leave it then. And it's been fantastic talking to you again. I can't wait to come back. Opportunity to invite you back again, and we'll carry on looking at this Monte Cassino series over the next couple of weeks. So thank everybody for your fantastic questions. Thank you, Glyn. And folks, I will see you all again in a few hours' time for this 8th Air Force show. Don't forget to click like and subscribe and buy my guests' books. Cheers, everybody. Thanks. Bye.
Thanks, Paul. See you.